most of us have some sort of organized group activity experience from when we were children. Whether it be Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and the like. For me, it was Cub Scouts, a gender-neutral mix of the two. We'd meet up every week at my local school, using their gym to do our activities, which really were nothing too interesting or creative. Hot potato with bean bags, coloring, and sometimes if our scout leader was feeling particularly adventurous in the winter, we'd walk to a local Tim Hortons for a cup of hot chocolate. Most of my time there didn't stand out to me. I was the only girl aside from one other, whose name at this point I can hardly remember. Perhaps it was Haley, I'm not really sure. But either way, it's not relevant to my story, honestly. In that place, the cabin in those woods, I'm not entirely sure what was and wasn't real there. A detail I can't dwell on for my own sake. The cabin was fun. A 2-room establishment settled into the woods, surrounded by birch and fir trees, nestled in a bit of a dip in the ground. In fact, before this all happened, I really looked forward to going there, spending some time in the woods building forts out of tree branches and playing manhunt in the trees. This only happened every once in a while though. Usually during early spring we'd drive out there with the scout leaders and a couple parent volunteers to spend a couple of days learning to make spears with a branch and pocket knife and how to do basic survival skills like setting a fire with only a couple of sticks. Fun fact about me: I never was able to figure out how to do that. Couldn't get the right momentum to generate sparks. Something to know about me is that I've always found it a bit more difficult to interact with other kids. So there I mainly kept to the fringes, only really speaking to others when spoken to, since my only friend that I'd made in the group hadn't been able to come. Thankfully for me, though, a younger girl was brought along, maybe 2 or 3 years my junior, and we'd come to get along quite well there. Being the only 2 girls present, the 2 of us built quite a nice fort with an open front, closed back and roof, and a nice bed of fur to make it more comfortable to huddle inside. In the end, us kids ended up building 2 different kingdoms. One that one half of the boys had made and another based around our little fort. Another bunch of the boys coming to join us and improve upon our masterpiece. This visit to the cabin seemed no different. We had a good time and several kids earned new badges. I didn't, but I also wasn't exactly aiming to, so I felt no disappointment in the matter. We also had the world's worst soup. It was just plain awful. I give it a pass as a soup enthusiast because it was cooked by the other kids, roughly 10 years old, but it was basically just frozen vegetables boiled in water. Among all these normal, boring tasks and activities, we'd gone geocaching. Now, if you aren't familiar with geocaching, don't be too disappointed. You really aren't missing anything. Basically, you follow a set of instructions which leads you through a set route to finding a little hidden box. In the box, there may be an interesting item or more instructions to find the next box. Really, it wasn't something that interested a group of 10-year-olds. There was a dozen of us kids and 2 scout leaders, both of which were attempting to engage us in the activity, explaining our way down gravel roads on a cloudy afternoon, the type of cloudy that's bright yet dreary. An obnoxious abrasive light that sucks all the color out of your surroundings. We found it more interesting to focus on the boy who'd been allowed to bring a camera, watching as he fiddled with it and filmed. The trees stood tall and proud around us, the sides of the road muddy. Occasionally one of the boys would leap into the dirt, only to be chastised by an adult and return back to the group for fear of accidentally being separated. This scenery felt familiar, something I was used to. My family had a cabin, though the woods were much more populated there, with many more cabins nearby as opposed to the singular cabin settled in the several-mile vicinity here. Gravel roads and woods were like a second home to me. The smell of incoming spring and the wet of the ground from the recently melted snow was something to be cherished and enjoyed. These are all things, aspects of my surroundings that I've found great comfort in, even today. But now there's a slight unease that accompanies it, the ever-present feeling of wrongness permeating the air. It always feels like there's something following me, which anyone will know is not the best feeling to have while wandering the woods. Slowly, white speckled our surroundings. We paid no mind to it. The snow had only recently begun to melt, and really with the erratic weather that our area boasted, we could get a fresh dump of snow any day now. It wouldn't have been surprising if only a part of the woods had been snowed over, leaving our area free of the cold and ice while another looked like that of a wintry wonderland. This, however, was not the case. The thickness of these blots of white turned to swats covering the ditches with a heavy coat of something stark white, something of which still remained uninteresting at first glance. In our young minds, it only reinforced our snow theory. But once the first kid stepped on the first bone, however, a resounding crack echoing around us, we all paid it a bit more attention. almost as distinct as the oddity of the situation itself was our lack of a reaction. None of us were shocked, surprised, or frightened by the bones that blanketed the woods floor like snow. We only found it more interesting than anything. At a closer glance, they were small animal bones. Maybe that of a squirrel or a chipmunk, but the sheer, unimaginable volume of them as to nearly be mistaken as snow. There had to be the remains of hundreds, or hell, thousands of small animals surrounding us. Our chatter morphed from talk of the camera, requests of what should be filmed next, to theorizing just how all these animals had died here en masse. I only recognized this in hindsight. The sudden and complete silence of the forest surrounding us. I didn't know the possible implications of this, and had merrily joined in the discussion with my peers. What I had noticed, however, was the sudden nervous silence that had overtaken our counselors. They'd still steered us forward, further into the sea of bone, but had ceased in their explanations. It didn't strike as odd to me, nor did it likely to the others, but as time passed and we continued through, the remains still thick around us, our scout leaders had pulled us to a standstill, explaining briskly that we were going to be late for lunch if we didn't turn around, and that we'd see about continuing this activity at a later time. None of us were raring to do that, something of which they were likely banking on. We turned around, picking our way through trampled bones back to our camp. And eventually, as the remains waned around us, noise returned. The chirping of birds calling from their perches in trees, and the odd squirrel darting across the path in front of us. That was the first strange occurrence to take place in that camp, something that should have alerted us that something was wrong, that we weren't necessarily as safe as we'd previously thought. "Emily, there's wolf fur in our fort," Katie yelled to me as I crossed through the cabin's campsite and into the woods. She was crouched just outside the mouth of our little fort, staring up at me as she simultaneously gestured down at something. When I'd finally gotten far enough into the woods to meet her, I myself got a proper glance at what she was pointing out. I'd never seen wolf fur, but it did look like dog fur at the very least. A gray clump of hair caught on a twig sticking inwards from a branch holding up the back wall of the fort. The idea of wolves being around the areas made sense. Our counselor had stated he'd found some around the camp. Whether that was actually the case or he was intending to try and scare us, I'm not sure. But finding fur that seemed to belong to some type of canine cemented the idea that perhaps he really had found something. "Well, that's so cool. Maybe we'll get to see a wolf," I exclaimed, to which Katie puffed up her chest in pride. "I already saw one." I blinked. "Wait, when would you have been able to see one?" At all points that we were outside, I'd been at her side and I'd certainly not seen any wolves. That would certainly have been something I'd remember. Well, I had to go pee in the middle of last night, and my mom walked with me to the outhouse cause it was dark, and I saw one out in the woods. Are you sure it wasn't just another raccoon? A rather hilarious incident had taken place not long after we'd arrived here, involving one of the boys opening the outhouse's door only to be met by a raccoon outraged at having its privacy invaded so rudely. "No," she replied emphatically, shaking her head. "It was way too tall to be a raccoon. It could have been climbing up a tree when you saw it," I offered, to which she once again vehemently disagreed. "I know what a raccoon looks like, I really doubted that, but conceded. I didn't really not believe her about the situation, but it just seemed like a pretty tall tale." I kept the thought at the back of my mind for the rest of the day, a part of me hoping that it was true and there really was a wolf around the area. This may seem like a strange thing to desire, given that it is a wild animal, but my 10-year-old mind hardly cared for that in the moment. Instead, more focused on how cool it would be to see a wolf outside of a documentary. We didn't end up finishing geocaching, instead staying inside the general vicinity of the campfire to cook bannock on sticks over the fire pit and whittle sticks. At roughly 7:30 we all returned inside, the fireplace being lit to warm us as the temperature continued to plummet for the evening. The group of us kids who wanted one eating muffins and drinking hot cocoa as we gathered around its warmth and talked over the day's events. Katie decided to go to our bunk early, not wanting a muffin or anything, while I remained up and awake with the boys, a quiet observer to their conversations. Eventually, the scoutmasters shuttled us all off to our beds. We all had to get up early in the morning the next day, after all, to get started with its activities. Early in the morning, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I sat up groggily, peering around the mostly dark building, the only light coming from the still-lit fireplace. The unease seemed to come from my needing to go to the washroom, likely from drinking so much before going to sleep. Now my social awkward shyness comes into play. I didn't want to wake any of the adults up to go with me outside to visit the restroom. The combined embarrassment of having to do so mixed with the fact I'd have to interrupt their sleep proved to be something I was entirely unwilling to do. I tried to roll over, to go back to sleep and ignore my bladder. But everyone knows that once you've woken up from something like that, you aren't going back to sleep without dealing with it first, carefully. As quietly as I could, I climbed down my bunk's ladder and crept to the second room, which housed our shoes as jackets. The snores of those around me did not falter, so I felt assured that no one had heard me get up and I wasn't about to get into trouble for it. I really wish someone had woken up. Someone had just gone with me, or hell, I just held it for the rest of the night. Finding the outhouse wasn't too hard. Trying to avoid the rabbit shit and cobwebs inside, however, was a whole different story. I ended up hovering to do my business. The type that you do when using a public bathroom at a rest stop or a McDonald's, while using the hand sanitizer. A loud, heavy thud slammed into the side of the outhouse, making me jump in fright. Stock still. I stared. That's not funny, I squeaked, voice coming out less stern and sure than I meant it to have. Someone must have seen me sneak out. Maybe a counselor or one of the boys, and now they were attempting to scare me for it. Personally, I did not appreciate that notion very much. Whoever was behind it, they didn't answer. My confidence waned slightly. Hey, just say something. Slam. I couldn't help a gasp of shock. I was equal parts frightened and angry, one half of me worried over the what-ifs. What if that wasn't someone I knew, while the other was angry at whoever was messing with me? It wasn't funny. Nothing about it was funny in the least bit. And I wanted to give whoever it was who decided that they were just so hilarious a piece of my mind. I threw the door open and stomped outside, running around behind the outhouse to find the culprit. Nothing, no one. The area behind it was vacant of anyone or anything that could have caused that noise. Anger was replaced by simmering fear and confusion. Eyes darting around, looking for any possible cause to the noise. Katie. Her voice loud and clear rang out from the tree line, drawing my attention away. Katie, I replied hesitantly, taking a step closer. Emmy, I found the wolf. Come see. Come see. She sounded so awake. Yet just moments early she had been dead asleep below me on the bunk bed. Katie, you shouldn't be out here. There's no wolf. Come inside with me. I shuffled a couple of steps closer. Movement flashed before me. Briefly, something shifting in the bushes. But Emmy, her voice morphed, changing from her usual mischievous lilt to something not dissimilar to rough wood, scraping and jarring. There is a wolf. Its hands, if they even were hands, were rough, calloused. It snatched me by the hair and dragged me with such sudden force I had not even the time to think of screaming, of responding in any way at all. I can't remember getting from point A to point B. It feels almost as though there's a mental block between me and what happened in that time. Perhaps I should be grateful to not remember what happened. But the thing about not being able to remember something like this is the fact I had no choice in the matter. Never knowing what happened in that time will haunt me. I'll never have the closure of an explanation. My head ached something fierce, pulsating from my scalp in vicious waves. Later, I'd learned that I was pulled with such force and violence that my scalp had lifted and detached from my skull, causing nerve damage that I still struggle with today. I felt sick to my stomach, dizzy as I wandered with my only desire being to get home, to get away from this all. Delirium burdened my mind, or at least I hoped it was. Inaudible chatter, distant and overlapping, followed me as I stumbled my way further into the bowels of the forest. Moist leaves beneath my shoes squelched, and amongst the darkness I wandered, passing tree after tree. I should have just waited for morning, or woken up an adult to go to the washroom, not wander out into the middle of the darkness where there was no light to guide me. To have waited and not followed that voice. I should have used my head, remembered that Katie was fast asleep and certainly not out in the woods. I've walked through the dark woods before, but never alone. I was always accompanied by my parents or an older cousin. But here in a sea of unfamiliar trees at the mercy of the bitter cold in only pajamas and a light jacket, I was shivering in the 0 below weather, numbing the pain just slightly. I knew somewhere in the back of my head I should stop moving, should remain still and wait for sunrise. You aren't supposed to move when you find yourself lost in the woods. I knew this. It was something my parents had ingrained in both me and my little brother's heads since we so often spent time out there. But panic and terror had taken hold of my senses and I moved blindly. Ran in hopes that I could find someone to help take me back. The woods quieted, the chatter receding and disappearing, the relief instantaneous. The quiet was good. I felt better in the quiet. Les watched. My breath hitched as my foot slipped out from beneath me on a particularly wet patch of mud and I slammed to the ground. A whine tearing through my throat as I felt the mud and water seep through what little warmth my coat had provided and eradicate it entirely. The fabric of my coat and shirt stuck to my back and arms as I slowly, gingerly sat upright, eyes burning fiercely. I didn't bother to stifle the tears. There was no one there to see me cry, and even if there had, I'd be much too preoccupied by the human contact to care about any embarrassment. I couldn't even wipe away the tears that ran down my face without smearing myself with mud that caked itself upon my palms. I didn't stand or try to move. Only sat there and cried, but planted firmly to the ground as I wished and prayed for a way out of this. That it was some sort of nasty dream and that I'd wake up back at camp in the warmth of my bunk. Even better yet, at home curled up in bed with a cat, sleeping away the morning with my parents just downstairs drinking coffee and chatting away. As much as I hoped it would not come true, something I was aware of. Crack, a twig broke behind me, and my heart snapped in the direction of the noise, sobs ceasing into mere hitched breaths. My eyes roved the woods, carting through trees and bushes, attempting to pierce through the darkness with little success. As much as my eyes had adjusted, it still wasn't enough to clearly make out my surroundings. My heart raced, pulse thundering in my ears, and for a moment, I listened, entirely still waiting for the next noise to indicate that something was nearby. So many images flashed through my head in that time. Massive grizzly bears ripping me to pieces. Men with axes ready to cut my head off and drive a spike through it to use as a warning to my fellow campers, and monsters of unbelievable horror. The type of beasts written about in the legends of old that I'd taken such a liking to reading about in the local library. The thoughts mounted and mounted. And when the next noise broke through the still, chilled air even closer than before, I was nearly blinded by fear. My entire body locked up. An unfortunate fear response that I had just then learned that I had possessed. Finally, something moved in my periphery, something large, bulky, and looming above my body as it crept forward. A rotten smell followed the appearance of this beast. Something that stank of rot and musk of some sort, getting more and more powerful as it approached me. I did not move, wishing that I could sink into the wet earth below me, my vision blurred with tears. And the thing was obscured from my sight, something that both simultaneously relieved and terrified me in equal measures. I could feel warm, rancid breath graze the top of my head, sending my hair into disarray as it panted above me, just as I was accepting my imminent death. A big, wet nose nudged at my ear. I flinched, hands clenching so hard my nails felt as though they were about to pierce the flesh of my palms. Again, the creature nudged my face, this time knocking my glasses ague. A deep, bone-rattling churring filled the air around me, instinct demanding that I must cover my ears to shield myself from the noise that shook my eardrums. Finally, my body caught up with my mind, and I scuttled away, desperately clawing at leaves and mud, doing anything to put space between me and this thing. For the first and last time that night, I caught sight of it, was truly able to look this creature over and imprint its features into my mind. Tall and muscular, it leaned forward in a hunched position, figure a mix between human and dog-like. Thick dark fur lined its body like armor. Its face was deformed in the purest sense. Jaw much too large, jutting out awkwardly with human-like teeth sticking out in any which direction. Its head was lumpy and misshapen. Ears perched where a human's would, however they were long and thin, fur lining the edges. Its eyes, however, were the most striking. They were large, golf ball-sized and milky. It was difficult to even see if they were moving, following me as I pressed myself up against the tree, panting as I stared it down in abject horror. It made no approach, remaining still as it analyzed me, much like I did to it. Carefully, on shaking legs, I stood bracing the tree blindly, eyes remaining fixed on this creature. I'd never felt like prey before, standing in front of something that deep down I knew could snuff me out as if it were nothing. It was a feeling akin to walking into a lion's den with a beef collar around your neck. I backed around it, taking a few hesitant steps. It responded with its own much larger ones. Several more steps. It followed still. It covered so much more ground, was gaining much quicker than I could move. So in a moment of fight or flight, I turned my back to the creature like an idiot and ran. The rest of my time in those woods was hazy. The fear was dizzying and I was so concentrated in escaping this predator that it was like my mind gave up and shit itself. There are moments that remain, moments that it got so near that I felt its breath on my neck or it would block my path, sending me off in another direction. At points I thought about giving up, about just dropping to the forest floor and letting it do whatever it had intended, to eat me and chew on my bones or simply kill me for sport. But now, years later, I've realized that it never had any intention of killing me. It was corralling me, guiding me in the right direction of my camp again, if it had wanted to. With its clearly demonstrated speed and strength, it could have killed me at any moment, and yet it didn't. It was protecting me. Near sunrise, I'd made it back in utter hysterics. I doubt they ever understood a word I said. I'd tried to explain, to tell them that I'd been dragged into the woods and then chased by a monster. But I was too busy shivering and blubbering to really get the words out. The police were there, and I ended up being taken to a hospital where my parents met up with me and the officers. They always figured that I'd conjured up the image of some beast to mask something else. That maybe I'd been lured out there by someone who'd tried to hurt me. But all those prerequisite tests came back clean. It was obvious I'd been assaulted in some way, that the injuries I'd sustained were neither self-inflicted nor a natural accident. But never did they find any culprit. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain myself, giving up and allowing myself to go along with their narrative. It's better for them, I suppose, to think that there's someone behind everything that happens there. The mass animal deaths, the missing hunters rather than something. They don't believe it because it's unbelievable. And I understand this. I know, however, that it is true, that there is something impossible behind all the horrors in that forest. I won't ever return, even if I am one of the lucky ones. Seeing those things once was enough to turn me off of those woods for life. And I'm not going to chase trouble. I don't know if they give second chances, if it will protect me again. I am grateful to it, though. Grateful for the kindness it showed in helping me. There's something in the woods of my old Cub Scouts camp, and while it spared me, I don't know what its intentions were behind that act. I don't know if it's what hunts people there, or protects them from something else. I don't know which is better or worse for us all.